Some people build empires, but they forget to build a life. Some people dream of success, but they never dream of love. And then there are those rare moments when two worlds collide, when the person you least expected teaches you the lesson you needed most. This is the story of a man who had everything except a reason to smile, and a girl who had nothing except hope. Adrian Blackstone is 38 years old, powerful, cold, and alone. He built Blackstone Motors from scratch and transformed it into one of America's most prestigious car manufacturers. His employees fear him. His competitors respect him. His bank account is full. But his life is empty. Then comes Emily Carter, 24, desperate, and holding a worn resume in trembling hands. She arrives at Blackstone Motors on a rainy morning looking for a miracle. What she doesn't know is that she's about to become one. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, the massive iron gates of Blackstone Motors groaned open with the weight of another demanding day. The factory sprawled across 20 acres of steel and ambition, a monument to one man's relentless pursuit of excellence and power. The early light cast long shadows across the imposing architecture, sharp lines, cold surfaces, everything designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Inside the sprawling complex, the factory floor hummed to life with mechanical precision. Hundreds of workers moved between gleaming assembly lines like carefully programmed robots, each one aware that a single mistake could cost them their job. The factory was a machine, and every human being inside it understood they were merely interchangeable parts. The only difference was that some parts were more expendable than others. But there was a place in Blackstone Motors where the air felt different. Where people moved quietly and carefully, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Where every word was measured, every gesture deliberate. That place was the executive office on the top floor, where Adrian Blackstone sat behind a mahogany desk that cost more than most houses. Adrian Blackstone had mastered the art of silence as a weapon. He was tall, with sharp features that might have been handsome if they weren't always arranged in an expression of barely concealed contempt. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his tailored suits impeccably pressed, and his watch cost more than the monthly salary of 90% of his employees. He represented success in its most crystalline form, a man who had built something extraordinary through intelligence, determination, and an almost pathological inability to accept mediocrity. What nobody knew, what Adrian himself barely admitted, was that his greatest achievement was also his deepest prison. The empire he had built had consumed him entirely. There were no friends, only business associates. No hobbies, only work. No relationships, only transactions. Adrian Blackstone had optimized his life for success the way he optimized his factories for production, removing every inefficiency, every unnecessary element, every human complication that might slow him down. The result was a life of astonishing emptiness. He arrived at the factory at precisely 6:45 every morning. He left at precisely 7:30 every evening. In between, he reviewed reports, attended meetings, made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, and never once smiled. His employees didn't know his first name was Adrian. To them, he was simply Blackstone, the cold entity who controlled their fates, the man who could destroy careers with a single word. Adrian preferred it this way. Respect was worth more than affection. Fear was more reliable than loyalty. Loneliness was the price of greatness, and Adrian had long since decided he would pay it. But on that particular rainy morning, as Adrian reviewed the quarterly production reports with his characteristic indifference, something was about to change his entire world. The rain that fell on the city of Rivermont that day was the kind that made people regret their choices. It fell in thick, relentless sheets that turned streets into rivers and reduced visibility to nothing. It was the kind of weather that made people show their true character. The selfish ones rushed without regard for others, the desperate ones moved more desperately still, and the hopeful ones simply tried to believe that somehow, everything would work out. Emily Carter was soaking wet. She was 24 years old, 5'6", with brown eyes that held something between determination and desperation. Her second-hand coat, purchased 3 years ago from a thrift store, had absorbed so much rainwater that it now weighed nearly twice what it should. Her shoes were older still, their soles worn thin by the countless miles she had walked looking for work. Her hair, once carefully brushed that morning, now hung in wet strands against her face. She was, in appearance, every stereotype of a person who was down on their luck. But there was something else about Emily Carter that transcended appearance. There was a quality in the way she carried herself despite everything, a kind of resilience that suggested life had already thrown its worst at her and she was still standing. There was kindness in the way she moved through the world, a small, tired kindness, but kindness nonetheless. Emily had been looking for work for 4 months. 4 months of rejection emails. 4 months of interviews where she felt like she was auditioning for a role she would never get. 4 months of returning to the small apartment she shared with her mother, where the rent grew more impossible to pay with each passing week. 4 months of that slow, creeping despair that comes from trying your best and watching it not be enough. The job posting for a factory assistant position at Blackstone Motors had appeared on the employment website at 2 in the morning. Emily had been awake, as she often was, unable to sleep due to a combination of stress and hope. She had read the listing 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. No experience required. Basic organizational skills necessary. Competitive pay. It was, in a word, a miracle. She had spent the rest of the night updating her resume, researching the company, and practicing answers to interview questions she anticipated they would ask. When morning came, she had showered, put on her best clothes, and set out for Blackstone Motors with the kind of hope that only comes when you've been rejected so many times that you've learned to protect yourself emotionally while still believing, somehow, that this time would be different. The bus broke down 3 blocks from the factory. Emily watched from the window as the driver shook his head and announced that the engine had overheated and everyone needed to exit. She looked at the clock on her phone, 6:52. Her interview was at 7 o'clock. The factory was 3 blocks away, but in this rain, 3 blocks felt like an impossible distance. She ran. People who have never been truly desperate don't understand the particular quality of desperation that propels you forward through rain-soaked streets, past people who stare at you with indifference, toward a destination that represents either salvation or another disappointment. Emily's shoes splashed through puddles, her wet coat flapped against her legs, and her resume, carefully placed in a plastic folder, was pressed against her chest. By the time she reached the gates of Blackstone Motors, she was not just wet. She was bedraggled. She was gasping. She was 7 minutes late. What Emily didn't know was that Adrian Blackstone had a rule about lateness. He considered it a form of disrespect. In his mind, if you couldn't respect his time enough to arrive on schedule, then you didn't deserve to work for him. He had turned away dozens of otherwise qualified candidates because they had been 5 minutes late. He would turn away hundreds more for the same reason. Adrian's assistant, Marcia, a 55-year-old woman who had worked for Adrian long enough to have developed a kind of emotional callousness toward his cruelty, escorted Emily upstairs. Emily left wet footprints on the polished marble floor. She felt acutely aware of every imperfection about her appearance, every way that she fell short of the professional standards of this gleaming, cold place. Adrian's office was even more intimidating than she had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the factory floor. The furniture was expensive and modern and entirely unwelcoming. Behind the mahogany desk sat the man himself, looking up at Emily with an expression that suggested he had just discovered something unpleasant on the bottom of his shoe. "You're late," he said. He didn't look up from his paperwork. Emily's heart sank, but she forced herself to respond. "I'm sorry. The bus broke down." Adrian finally looked at her, his dark eyes traveling from her dripping hair to her wet shoes with the kind of cold assessment that made people feel small. "Excuses don't build cars, Miss Carter. They only take up time that could be spent on actual work." It was a line he had used 100 times before, and it had broken 100 job candidates' spirits. He expected Emily to apologize again, to accept defeat, to thank him for his time and leave. This was how it always went. But Emily did something that Adrian didn't expect. She didn't leave. Instead, she stood there, water still dripping from her coat, and spoke in a voice that wasn't aggressive but was absolutely unwavering. "You're right, Mr. Blackstone. Excuses don't build cars. And I didn't come here to make excuses. I came here because I need this job, and more importantly, I came because I believe I can be good at it. I know you probably get hundreds of applications, and I know I'm not the most polished candidate who's walked through that door. But I promise you this, I will work harder than anyone you've hired. I will learn faster. I will care more. And most importantly, I will show up every single day." Adrian stared at her. In his entire career, nobody had ever spoken to him this way. Employees didn't assert themselves. Candidates didn't demand to be heard. The world had learned to fear Adrian Blackstone, to accommodate him, to bend around his will like grass in a strong wind. And yet here stood this soaking wet girl in a worn coat, with nothing to offer but her determination and her hope, refusing to accept rejection. Something flickered in Adrian's chest. It was a small thing, barely noticeable. If he had been a different kind of man, he might have identified it as intrigue. As interest. As the first sign that his carefully constructed walls were beginning to develop cracks. But Adrian Blackstone was not a man who looked inward. He returned his gaze to his paperwork and picked up a folder from his desk. "You have 1 week," he said coldly. "Prove that your promises mean something. If you waste my time, Miss Carter, you'll regret it." Emily reached out and took the folder with hands that were still shaking, though whether from fear or adrenaline, she couldn't have said. "Thank you, Mr. Blackstone. You won't regret this." Adrian didn't respond. He was already back to his paperwork, his attention having already moved on to the next item on his relentless agenda. The factory assistant position was supposed to be the easiest job in the company. Technically, the person in that role was responsible for administrative tasks, filing, organizing, scheduling, all of the invisible work that kept the factory operating but that nobody particularly cared about. The previous assistant had quit after 2 weeks, claiming the work was beneath her. The one before that had lasted 3 weeks before having some kind of breakdown and simply never returning. Adrian had predicted Emily would last 5 days, maybe 6 if she was particularly stubborn. He was very badly wrong. Emily didn't just stay. She transformed the job entirely. Within her first 3 days, she had reorganized the filing system that the company had been using for years, a system that Adrian had always accepted as adequate but that Emily immediately recognized as inefficient. She created new systems for scheduling maintenance and tracking inventory. She discovered that the factory was losing money because certain supplies were being ordered redundantly, sometimes by people who didn't even know other departments were ordering the same things. Most importantly, she did all of this while treating every single person in the factory, from the senior managers to the custodial staff, with genuine kindness. Adrian noticed because it was impossible not to notice. Workers who had been robotic and afraid suddenly seemed energized. People smiled more. The factory didn't change its fundamental nature, but something intangible shifted. There was a little more light in it now. A little more humanity. He watched Emily from his office as she worked the factory floor, and something that he had thought dead inside him began, very slowly, to wake up. By the end of the week, Adrian had made a decision. He would keep her. But what he didn't know was that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would destroy the walls he had spent his entire life building, and replace them with something far more valuable and far more terrifying. Love doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself. It simply begins to exist in the space between two people, growing silently, reshaping everything, until one day you realize that the world is completely different than it was before. For Adrian Blackstone, that day was coming. And when it arrived, he would finally understand that the most important thing he had ever built was not made of steel and precision engineering. It was made of moments, of connection, of a girl with wet shoes and a worn coat who refused to accept defeat, and who somehow saw the human being beneath the ruthless boss. She was about to teach him something he had spent 38 years avoiding learning. That success without someone to share it with is just expensive emptiness. And that sometimes, the greatest discovery you can make is that you have been lonely all along, and you never even knew it. 3 weeks passed, and Adrian Blackstone couldn't remember what his life had looked like before Emily Carter walked into his office with wet shoes and soaking hair. The change was so gradual that at first, even he didn't notice it. It started small, a smile that would catch him off guard, a laugh that escaped before he could stop it, a moment of genuine human connection in a day that had previously been filled only with transactions and decisions. It was like waking up from a sleep so deep he hadn't even known he was sleeping. Emily had settled into her role at the factory with a grace that surprised everyone. She worked harder than anyone Adrian had ever hired, but it wasn't the desperate, broken kind of hard work that came from fear. It was purposeful. Joyful, even. She found meaning in what she did because she chose to see meaning in it. A filing system wasn't just administrative work, it was creating order from chaos. Scheduling maintenance wasn't just logistics, it was taking care of something important. The factory workers responded to her in ways they had never responded to anyone before. Adrian watched from his office as Emily ate lunch in the cafeteria with the assembly line workers, asking them about their families, remembering their names, genuinely interested in their lives. He watched as she helped Marcus, one of the forklift operators, study for his high school diploma at night. He watched as she organized a small birthday celebration for Patricia from shipping, a woman who had worked at Blackstone Motors for 15 years without anyone ever acknowledging her birthday. These small acts of kindness rippled through the factory like stones thrown into still water. People who had been angry began to smile. People who had been ready to quit suddenly found reasons to stay. Production increased. Quality improved. But most importantly, the place that had always felt like a machine designed to extract labor from human beings began to feel, somehow, like a community. Adrian told himself that this was good for business. But he knew, in the quiet moments when he was alone in his office, that something far more dangerous was happening. He was changing. And he was terrified. One evening, about 4 weeks after Emily had started, Adrian stayed late at the factory reviewing quarterly reports. The numbers were excellent, the best they had been in years. Production was up. Efficiency had improved. The factory was running like a perfectly calibrated machine. In the old Adrian's mind, this would have been a moment of triumph. Instead, he found himself feeling oddly empty looking at these numbers. Numbers that had once meant everything suddenly seemed to mean very little. Around 8 o'clock, Emily appeared at his office door. "You're still here?" she asked, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Adrian looked up at her, and for a moment, he forgot to be the ruthless boss. He forgot to be the man who had built everything through fear and intimidation. He simply saw her, this extraordinary person who had somehow walked into his life and changed everything about it. "I had some reports to review," he said. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. The truth was that he had been sitting at his desk for an hour without actually reading anything, simply thinking about Emily. "You look exhausted," Emily said, setting one of the coffee cups on his desk. "I'm fine." "You always say that." Emily sat down in the chair across from his desk without asking permission. A month ago, Adrian would have considered this inappropriate. Now, he found it refreshingly honest. "You know, Mr. Blackstone, one of the things I've learned from working here is that you're allowed to not be fine sometimes." Adrian looked at her, this girl who had entered his life from nowhere, who wore second-hand clothes without shame, who worked harder than anyone he knew because she wanted to, not because she was afraid. "What makes you an expert on my well-being?" he asked, but his tone was different now. Softer. "I'm not an expert," Emily said, blowing on her coffee. "But I know what it looks like when someone is running on empty. I know what it looks like when someone has built a life that looks perfect from the outside but feels hollow on the inside." Adrian set down his pen. Something about the way she said this made him think she wasn't just talking about him. "How do you know what that looks like?" Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. She told him about her childhood in a poor neighborhood where her father had left when she was 5, leaving her mother to work 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. She told him about going to school hungry some days, about wearing hand-me-down clothes, about the shame she had felt about not having what other kids had. She told him about her mother's recent health problems, about the fear that had gripped her when she realized she might lose the one person who had always believed in her, no matter how hard things got. And then she told him about something else. "When I was 18, I had a teacher named Mr. Harrison," Emily said. "He was poor too, he grew up in the same neighborhood I did. He told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Emily, poverty teaches you something that money can never teach you. It teaches you that you're stronger than your circumstances. It teaches you that your worth isn't determined by what you own or what you have. It teaches you that the only real currency in life is kindness.'" I didn't understand what he meant back then. I was so focused on escaping poverty that I thought if I just had enough money, everything would be okay. "And now?" Adrian asked. "Now I know he was right," Emily said. "Money isn't the answer to everything. I've met people with millions who are miserable. And I've met people with nothing who are genuinely happy because they know how to find joy in small things. A coffee shared with a friend. A job well done. Someone remembering your name." Adrian realized that his hands were shaking slightly. He had spent his entire adult life in pursuit of money, in pursuit of power, in pursuit of success. And in doing so, he had built walls so high that no one could reach him. He had become a prisoner in his own empire. "I've never told anyone this," Emily continued, "but when I walked into your office that day, soaking wet and desperate, I was planning to give up. I was planning to go home and tell my mom that maybe we should just accept that our life was going to be hard. That maybe I should stop trying and just accept my circumstances. But you gave me a chance." Adrian shook his head. "I almost turned you away. You were late. But you didn't," Emily said. "And that one decision, that choice to give someone a chance, it changed my life. It showed me that sometimes, the people who seem the coldest are actually just the ones who are most afraid to feel anything." Something inside Adrian broke open that night. He had spent 38 years telling himself that feelings were a liability, that connection was a distraction, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. But looking at Emily now, seeing the kindness and strength in her eyes, he understood that he had been wrong about everything that mattered. "My mother is sick," he said quietly. He had never told anyone this before. "That's why I became obsessed with building all of this. When I was young, my mother got very ill. We didn't have much money, and watching my father struggle to pay her medical bills, watching him sacrifice everything, it broke something in him. After she recovered, he was never the same. So I decided I would make so much money that I would never be vulnerable like that again. I would never have to need anyone. I would never have to depend on another person. And I built all of this." He gestured around his office, at the symbols of his success. "But I also built a life where I was completely alone." Emily reached across the desk and took his hand. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she said. Adrian looked at their hands together, this simple gesture of human connection, and for the first time in decades, he cried. The weeks that followed were a revelation to Adrian Blackstone in ways that defied explanation. He began to live differently. He started taking Saturdays off, something he hadn't done in 15 years. He had coffee with Emily, and they talked about life, about dreams, about fears. He learned that she wanted to go back to school to become a counselor. That she wanted to help other people who had experienced poverty and hardship. He learned that her favorite color was green, that she couldn't cook to save her life but was determined to learn, that she had a laugh that could light up even his darkest moods. And she learned about him too. She learned that underneath the ruthless businessman was a man who had been terrified of needing people, terrified of loss, terrified of being vulnerable. She saw the photographs in his office that he had taken down years ago because looking at them reminded him too much of his mother. She listened as he told stories about his childhood, about the person he might have been if fear hadn't shaped so much of his life. One afternoon, about 2 months after Emily had started working at Blackstone Motors, she fell ill at work. It started as a simple headache, but by midday, she was running a fever and could barely stand. Adrian found her in the factory bathroom looking pale and shaken. Without hesitation, he drove her to the hospital himself. In the waiting room, as he sat beside her while doctors ran tests, Adrian realized something profound. For the first time in his life, his company's quarterly reports, his expanding empire, his countless achievements, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was this girl, this remarkable person who had somehow become his entire world. Emily was admitted with pneumonia. She spent 5 days in the hospital, and Adrian was there every single day, from the moment she woke up until they made him leave at night. He sat by her bed and held her hand. He brought her books and read to her. He listened as she talked about her mother and her fears and her dreams. And then on the 3rd day, he did something that shocked everyone, including himself. He went to the hospital and told them that he would cover all of Emily's medical bills. Not as a loan. Not as a business transaction. Simply as a gift, from someone who had finally learned what mattered in life. When Emily found out, she cried. "Why would you do this?" she asked. Adrian sat on the edge of her hospital bed and looked at this girl who had somehow become the center of his universe. "Because you reminded me that success means nothing if you have nobody to care about," he said. "Because you showed me that the most important currency in life isn't money, it's connection. It's kindness. It's caring about another human being so much that their happiness becomes more important than your own success." Emily reached out and pulled him close, and Adrian let himself be pulled. He let himself feel. He let himself be vulnerable for the first time since he was a child. When Emily recovered from pneumonia, she returned to work, but everything had changed. Adrian changed his will, changing the beneficiaries to include Emily. He started the Adrian Blackstone Foundation for workers in need, using his fortune to help people in difficult circumstances. People like Emily, people like her mother, people like all the workers in his factory who struggled and persevered despite overwhelming odds. He reduced his working hours and spent more time on the factory floor, talking to people, learning about their lives. He implemented new policies, better wages, better benefits, education assistance for workers who wanted to improve themselves. The factory that had once been a machine designed to extract labor became something different. It became a place where people mattered. Where humanity was valued. But the most important change was in Adrian himself. He learned to smile. It started as a small thing, a slight upturn of his lips when Emily said something funny. Then it became more frequent. Then it became genuine. His employees barely recognized him. The ruthless boss who had terrified them had been replaced by someone who actually saw them, who valued them, who treated them with respect and kindness. 6 months after Emily had walked into his office in her wet coat and worn shoes, Adrian did something he had never done before. He took Emily to dinner, real dinner, not the hasty meals they shared at his office or in the factory cafeteria. He took her to the most elegant restaurant in the city, the kind of place where he had eaten alone for years without really enjoying any of it. And in that restaurant, in front of a room full of strangers, he took her hand and he asked her to marry him. Emily said yes through happy tears. I know you came to work at my factory looking for a job, Adrian said. But what you ended up giving me was so much more valuable than anything money can buy. You gave me a reason to be human. You gave me a reason to care. You gave me a reason to smile. Emily squeezed his hand. You gave me something too, she said. You gave me a chance when I had nothing. But more than that, you taught me that no one is truly unreachable. No matter how high their walls are, no matter how long they've been alone, there's always a possibility for change. You taught me that people are capable of extraordinary transformation when they finally decide to let someone in. A year later, Adrian and Emily were married in a small ceremony in the factory where they had met. All the workers were invited. The same workers who had once feared and resented their boss now celebrated him, because he had become something different. He had become human. Years passed, and Adrian Blackstone became known not just as the brilliant businessman who built an empire, but as a man who had learned, late in life, what actually mattered. He became known for his philanthropy, for his foundation that helped thousands of people escape poverty. He became known for treating his workers fairly, for creating an environment where people wanted to work, where they felt valued and respected. But most importantly, he became known for having finally learned how to love. Emily eventually did go back to school. She became a counselor, specializing in helping people who had experienced poverty and hardship, people like herself. She started programs at the factory to help workers develop new skills, to pursue education, to break cycles of poverty that had trapped their families for generations. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Adrian and Emily sat on the balcony of their home, overlooking the city lights below. Emily was pregnant with their first child, and Adrian found himself thinking about how much his life had changed. He thought about the man he had been, cold, disconnected, building monuments to his own success while his soul withered inside. What are you thinking about? Emily asked, nestling against him. I'm thinking about the day you walked into my office, Adrian said. I'm thinking about how I almost turned you away. I'm thinking about how one decision, the decision to take a chance on someone, ended up changing my entire life. Emily smiled and placed his hand on her belly. I think about it all the time, she said. I think about how desperate I was that day. I think about how I almost gave up. I think about how one moment can change everything. You saved my life, Adrian said. You know that, right? Not because you healed some wound or fixed some problem. But because you showed me that life without connection is just existence. You taught me that success without someone to share it with is just empty. Emily turned to look at him. You saved mine too, she said. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You gave me a chance when no one else would. But more than that, you showed me that change is possible. That people can transform. That someone can go from being closed off from the world to being completely open to love. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city, feeling the new life growing inside Emily, and both of them understood something fundamental about the human experience. The most important thing you can ever build is not an empire. It's not a legacy measured in dollars and success. It's not a monument to your own achievement. The most important thing you can ever build is a connection with another human being. The most important thing you can ever do is let someone love you. The most important thing you can ever be is kind. Adrian Blackstone, the ruthless factory boss, had built an empire. But it wasn't until he met Emily Carter that he built a life worth living. It wasn't until he learned to let someone in that he discovered what he had been searching for all along. Not success. Not power. Not wealth. Simply, and profoundly, someone to smile at. Years later, when Adrian was much older, he would sit with his children and tell them the story of their mother. He would tell them about the girl who walked into his office soaking wet, desperate, but unwilling to accept defeat. He would tell them about how she changed not just his life, but the lives of thousands of workers through the foundation they built together. He would tell them that the greatest investment he ever made wasn't in his factory. It was in opening his heart to another human being. And Emily would add her own part to the story. She would tell their children about a man who had everything except a reason to smile. She would tell them about how she learned that kindness isn't weakness, that vulnerability isn't something to be feared, that the most powerful thing you can do is believe in people. The story of Adrian and Emily became legendary in their community. People spoke of them as an example of what love could do, how it could transform a person, how it could heal old wounds and create new possibilities. But the most important part of their story wasn't written in newspapers or business journals. It wasn't recorded in the financial success of their foundation or the productivity statistics of their factory. It was written in the quiet moments, in the way Adrian would reach for Emily's hand without thinking about it, in the way Emily would look at her husband with wonder even after all these years, in the way they had built a life together that honored both of their histories and dreams. The ruthless factory boss had learned the most important lesson of his life, not from any book or teacher or business mentor. He had learned it from a girl in a wet coat who refused to accept defeat. He had learned that success without love is empty. He had learned that the most important thing in life is not what you build or what you own or how much power you have. It's who you build it with. It's who you share it with. It's who makes you smile. And as Adrian Blackstone grew older, looking back on his extraordinary life, the empire he had built, the workers he had helped, the foundation that had changed countless lives, he knew with absolute certainty that the most important decision he had ever made wasn't to build Blackstone Motors. It was to say yes to a girl with wet shoes. Because that one decision gave him everything that actually mattered. It gave him love. It gave him connection. It gave him a reason to smile. The end.